Good evening. This is Jeffrey Tucker with Liberty.me, and tonight we're talking about one of my favorite books, Memoirs of a Superfluous Man by Nock. You know, I've been thinking about this a lot recently about, why is it that there's just in the course of like the last 100 years in the English language, fewer than maybe a couple of dozen writers that we can turn to and say, okay, this is an amazing man. This is a man who saw the problems of socialism and fascism, the person who saw the answers in the form of free enterprise and individual freedom and the volition of the individual. So few people saw this. It's actually remarkable when you start looking into this a little more thoroughly, and you start reading some of the intellectual history of the 1920s, 1930s, 40s, and 1950s, and so on. How many intellectuals of the time just had a complete disregard for the volition of the individual, for human liberty, for the capacity of society to manage itself, for a world absent central planning. It's amazing to think of it. The intellectual classes, how they're just so united on from the left and the right on the fact that socialism and capitalism, socialism and fascism are the only two alternatives that we really had. Free enterprise and democracy, freedom as it's been traditionally understood, was so widely considered to be obsolete by almost all the intellectuals at the time. It's amazing to think of it. Just read through the journals, sample the books that were published on politics, on economics in the 1930s. It's overwhelming just how deluded an entire class of intellectuals at the time were in the course of the 20th century. And it's actually remarkable. It strikes you, and you just have to shake your head in amazement. I mean, we're used to these days. Let me turn off that little. I think that's Liberty.me chat. Just turning off the sound there. These days, thanks to social media and massive online resources and access to libertarian-style liberal literature, we're very much used to being exposed to liberal ideas. Thanks to organizations like Students for Liberty, the Cato Institute for Humane Studies, Liberty.me, and so on, and 1,000 other organizations. Libertarian ideas are now creeping into mainstream thought and theory, but for the better part of 100 years, that really wasn't true. And I'm beginning to think that as our own century progresses, that I think there's going to be a little bit of a sort of a canonization that needs to start taking place, so to speak. I don't really mean saint making, but I mean recognition that there were writers in the English language who did resist, who did see what's true, and did tell what's true during the darkest days of the 20th century, where fascism and socialism were the only two options, at least the perceived options. And, F.A. Hayek, as I would say, right up there, Ludwig von Mises, of course, Murray Rothbard, started writing mid-century, and so many others, Robert Lefebvre, Leonard Reed, Ayn Rand, right? What can you say? And so many others like that. These are mostly post-war writers, but in the interwar period, before the war, there's lots of figures that are lost to history. I mean, these great writers and intellectuals, brilliant figures, not just because their politics were aligned with mine, but because they were just talented, just enormously talented people. And I'm thinking of people like Garrett, one of my favorite writers. And if you don't know him, look him up, download his books and read them. I mean, he's just an epic figure, Garrett. H.L. Mencken, right? I mean, yeah, his reputation still survives. You still hear about him from time to time. but actually, not that much. How many people really read Rachel Mencken? Whereas he was, probably the dominant intellectual force in American life all throughout the 19 teens and 1920s, leading up to the early 1930s. Just a formative figure. I don't know who to compare him to today. In fact, we don't have anybody to compare to H.L. Mencken today. But one of these men was Albert J. Nock. Albert J. Nock, whose reputation did not survive the Second World War. He was one of these many people who resisted both the New Deal and the Second World War. Um, you know, it's hard to imagine there's been a greater influence. I mean, in a sort of surreptitious and inauspicious way in the course of 20th century American resistance to the totalitarian state than Albert J. Nock. He was just extraordinary. Had so many essays, so many writings. He was the founding editor of the Freeman. The Freeman's today published by the Foundation for Economic Education, as it has been since the mid 1950s. But every publication has its founder, and the Freeman was founded by Albert J. Nock. And I'm not sure what year it would have been, but maybe just post World War I. So maybe 1920, something like that. The founding editor of the Freeman, and actually made a go of it. He was the editor, sold subscriptions, and it was a very prominent publication. He did very well for himself. Like many people of this generation, and I'm speaking of great writers like Garrett Garrett, I mentioned, H.L. Mencken, John T. Flynn was another one of these great men. Leonard Read actually was writing his earliest works date from that period, actually. But Albert J. Nock, I think, is singular. Just a powerhouse of literary force, an amazing voice for humane civilization, as an essayist, as they call him, a man of letters, but also I think in many ways a prophet, a brilliant prophet. Albert J. Nock was a progressive. They all thought of themselves this way. John T. Flynn was the same situation. They came out of the progressive era as considering themselves sort of old liberals. Liberals, not right wingers in any sense, but liberals in the old sense, who departed when liberalism went the way of the New Deal and started to embrace fascism. This generation of liberals, this handful of people, I'm talking about like 6, okay, or maybe a dozen people, decided not to go along with the new tendency of liberalism to embrace central planning, and favored free enterprise and freedom generally, libertarianism essentially, as the one and only answer. Many of them, interestingly, I think this is true for Garrett. It's certainly true for Nock. It's true for Chodorow. Actually, it's to mention another great name, Frank Chodorow, another one of my favorites. They were influenced by the laissez-faire vision of Henry George. There was Georges, actually, and Henry George is, as I've talked to you in the past, was one of the key literary influences probably between the 1880s and about 1930. Gigantic literary legacy. His book sold in the millions. Progress and Poverty was a huge book, hugely important, and a gigantic role, and influences generation of old right thinkers. He also influenced a lot of socialists, interestingly. But Albert J. Nock was a Georgist, like Chodorow, but he had his own take on things. So the book I'm talking about now is the book called Memoirs of a Superfluous Man, sometimes dated from 1943. It was his last book. It was supposed to be his biography. Somebody had asked him to write a biography of his life, so he did. And the result was this gigantic manuscript. I remember reading somewhere, I'm not sure where, I think it was the private memoirs of William F. Buckley. And Buckley's father was a good friend of Albert J. Nock, and Albert J. Nock was a dinner companion at Buckley's home. So he'd come home from college at Yale, and there would be Albert J. Nock, carrying forth the dinner table, which is an awesome thing, amazing. But this book, Memoirs of a Superfluous Man, um, Albert J. Nock, it was commissioned by him. He died a few years later, and Buckley's father, his name I can't remember, got an early version of it, just a big stack of papers. And William F. Buckley, I don't know, sophomore, junior year, or something like that in college, maybe it was freshman year, came home, and his father gave it to him and said, "Look, here's a memoirs by that guy who's been eating dinner with us. So what you think?" And Buckley read it in manuscript, and it changed his life, like completely. It made him. Um, it kickstarted his whole ideological career. It gave him a cast of mind that gave him a certain way of looking at the world that he never really recovered from. And to the end of his life, Albert J. Nock's Memoirs was the single most influential book. And okay, that's not to say Nock would have favored the Cold War as Buckley did. It's not true. But I understand this. I was a big fan of William F. Buckley for years before he died, in the sense that I appreciated his commentary, his outlook, his cast of mind. His individualist, slightly nonpartisan way of thinking about the world. His willingness to depart from the conventions of the time, they all came from Albert J. Nock. I get this. I mean, Buckley was, as we all know, had his problems. But in this sense, I think there's an element of Buckley that was always an anarchist. Remember, he departed from the right wing on a number of war issues at the end of the Cold War, and was always in favor of the legalization of drugs. So he was a special kind of right winger in that sense, And even to this day, some of his eccentricities survive at National Review. I'm so sorry. Hold on. And I think all this was drawn from Nock, and in particular this book. Memoirs is impossible to read without having a permanent effect on your life, essentially. And it's a very interesting book because it's a kind of a little bit of a Gnostic text, in the sense that most people will never read it. It's the least sort of popular book you'll ever encounter. I mean, it could never reach a mass audience under any circumstances. Even those who try to pick it up, like if you're listening to my talk right now, you might be interested in reading it, but once you pick it up, you'll discover that that it's a difficult read. I mean, like, you get through the first two chapters, and you wonder where he's going with this stuff. I mean, it's just it's opaque. It's difficult. It seems like it doesn't have any real substance to it at all, and you wonder what point he's trying to make. It seems to be just telling a series of slightly irrelevant stories, But that's Nock's way. I mean, it's almost like he wanted to discourage readership. He wanted, at the end of his life, I mean, we have to remember this is the 20th century, right? I mean, so totalitarianism was the prevailing ideology of the age, and true believers in freedom were rare. And, he was speaking to what he called the remnant, which is a tiny group of people who understood the truth and knew the truth, and could embrace the truth despite all the frenzies of public policy, hysterias, and absurdities of the time. So that's who he wrote this book for. And by the way, a number of people who've written about this book say that hardly anything in it is true. He was asked to write his autobiography, and he did. He wrote 350, 400 pages, but a lot of it is just purely made up, according to to his biographers. So a lot of it's not true. He tells very few personal details um, about his actual, the stuff you kind of want to know. He doesn't tell anything. The book consists of a series of beautiful vignettes of his life. And in the course of these vignettes, which he tells with great power and persuasiveness, he introduces, shocking anarchistic thoughts. That sort of blindsides you as you're going through it. It's like the last thing you expect. In the course of reading these very charming stories, that they conclude always with a tribute to the individual and a call for the capacity of society and its capabilities of managing itself, however difficultly, however roughly, however imperfectly. Albert J. Nock's conviction is that people, when they're left alone to manage their own lives, can cobble together a way of life that's better than any state could ever do. No matter how imperfect the world is, it cannot be in any sense improved by central planning or by any kind of state intervention, and is very likely to be depreciated, not improved, but just the reverse. That's the essential message of Memoirs. But you know what's so beautiful about this book? If you throw yourself into it and you start reading it carefully and you stick with it, and like I say, you have to get through the first 2 chapters. It's like he's culling out readers. He's desperately trying to, get people not to read him. So you have to get through the second chapter before it really starts to take on significance. It gives you an attitude of a kind of aloofness to public life, and a realization that the real core of life, the thing that makes it really wonderful and special, whether in economics or politics or otherwise, are the things we do ourselves in cooperation with our neighbors. The things that extend out of our individual human volition, not the things that are imposed on us by some masterful central plan. It's not politics from the top down that makes life meaningful, but rather the things that we organize ourselves, just the little pieces of life that happen to us as a result of our own choices, however imperfect they may be. And the life never gets any better than this. That's basically the message, I would say, of Memoirs of a Superfluous Man. Why superfluous? Well, it's Albert J. Nock talking. He always regarded himself as a little bit of a superfluous man, just not necessary, an unnecessary person, which is very sweet. So he's one of the great saints of the 20th century, as far as I'm concerned. And I would love it if everybody would read him. Unfortunately, he's not going to be well read. It's just not to everybody's taste. Okay, let me see if I can read some from this book, actually. I've just pulled it up here for him. It's just such a beautiful book. Okay, here's from page 64. One neighbor kept a flock of guinea fowl, which ran so wild over his rearward premises that when he wanted it one for dinner, he would shoot it. Our own place, one of the few rented houses out there, must have had at least 100-foot frontage, I think more. The house was well back from the street, and the garden running the full length of a long block behind it was remarkable for having large fruit trees in it, and a line of oversized blackberry bushes down on one side. I was more then I was more circumspect about blackberries after the day when I came within an ice of pawing in on the hideous huge spider which was sitting in the center of its web amidst the thick bushes. This monster was a bright yellow color with black stripes. I have seen others of the same size since, but never one more than half of its size. So just to give you a feel for its pros. Another neighbor, a patriarchal old Englishman with a white beard, kept a great stand of bees. I remember his incessant drumming on a tin pan to marshal them when they were swarming, and myself as idly wondering who first discovered that this was the thing to do. And why should the bees fall in with it? It struck me that if the bees were as intelligent as bees are cracked up to be, instead of mobilizing themselves for old man Reynolds' benefit, they would sting him soundly and fly off about their business. There's no paragraph break here. Okay, continue the paragraph. I always think of this when I see a file of soldiers and wondering why the sound of a drum does not incite them to shoot their officers, throw away their rifles, and go home and go to work. Why, instead of producing this effect, which seems natural and reasonable, does it produce one which seems exactly the opposite? In the course of time, I found that Virgil had remarked about the fact about bees. And then his parable called the drum, Count Tolstoy, right, Anarchist, had remarked the fact about human animal. Neither, however, had accounted for the fact. Virgil had not tried to account for it, and Count Tolstoy's attempt was scattering and unsatisfactory. So, just by reading that, you get a sense of what this book is like, right? I mean, so you're reading the course of just regular life, and from it, Nock discerns and deduces a general principle of human nature. So he's observing, the bee colony of the neighbor, wondering why the bees are so compliant, and then thinks, well, wait a minute, well, why are human beings so compliant? Of all things to do, to kill others, as a part of an army and risk being killed, just because some fife and drums are playing. Why don't people just turn around and shoot their officers and forget about the whole thing? So I mean that's the way Nock writes, and it's a shocking thing when you're reading through it, because it destabilizes you and you think, oh my God, he's saying outrageous things. Now keep in mind this book was written in 1943. You have to understand, the world of that time. So we've gone through the New Deal, just this absurd experiment and basically an American dictatorship, under FDR, which he resisted at every turn, and then plunged ourselves into war. And during the war, we had a form of central planning that rivaled anything going on in the enemy countries, which we decried as being fascistic and incompatible with the great American freedom. So we had, wage controls and price controls, and most men, of a certain age drafted, to kill and be killed. The home front was 100% mobilized on behalf of the war effort. So we got and on behalf of FDR, the completion of the New Deal, and then later Truman, a complete top-down system. Constitutionalism was thrown out the window. There was no such thing as limited government anymore. United States had become a kind of a top-down socialist fascist style regime. And Nock had been writing his whole life to resist this, right? I mean, he began as a progressive liberal in the late teens, writing this radical publication called the Freeman, which defended civil rights and civil liberties and freedom of speech, and then later free enterprise, challenged the New Deal, opposed the New Deal, lost basically this great struggle because of World War II. And this is his final tribute. So he's having to sneak in these kind of what must have been, you can imagine in the midst of World War II, to write things like soldiers should pick up their guns and shoot their officers and go home. That's a pretty outrageous thought. I mean, to us it just seems just funny and charming, but at the time, must have just seemed just beyond belief, just outrageous. So this was the essence of Nock, just saying things that are inadmissible to public life. Let me read some more. I've done this show several times, just talking about this book, and my favorite thing is just basically to read from the book. There's so much to read. I don't know where to begin. Okay. Nock, to keep in mind, Nock was an anarchist. I mean, he didn't describe himself that way. He never announced himself as such, but that's what he was. Whether by one means or another, I was still somehow prepared to see, as when I was still quite young I did see, that in our society the purview of legal, religious, and ethical sanctions was monstrously overextended. They had usurped control over an area of conduct much larger than rights and reason would assign them. On the other hand, I saw the area of conduct properly answerable to the sanctions of taste and manners was correspondingly attenuated. One could easily understand how this had come about. Law is the creature of politics, and the general course of politics, as among others, Mr. Jefferson, Franklin, and John Adams have clearly perceived, is always determined by an extremely low order of self-interest and self-aggrandizement. So, and he reflects in the past. Again, when Christianity became organized, it immediately took on a political character, radically affecting its institutional concept of religion and its institutional concept of morals. And the same tendencies are observable in secular politics that once set upon the politics of organized Christianity. Thus, the area of conduct in which men were free to recognize the sanctions of taste and manners was still further straightened. The consequence was that one set of sanctions atrophied and the other broke down, thus leaving human conduct bereft of any sanctions at all, save those of expediency. In other words, each person was left to do what was right in his own eyes. While with Bentham on one side and the hierarchies of law, religion, and morals on the other, American society had got itself cross-lifted into a practical doctrine of predatory and extremely odious nihilism. When the sanctions of law, religion, and morals broke down through the persistent misapplication to matters of conduct quite outside their purview, the sanction of taste and manners had become too frail and anemic to be of any practical good. For obvious reasons, the resultant state of our society seems beyond hope of improvement. Attempts to galvanize the sanctions of law, religion, and morals for further misapplication are ineffective, and ineffective must also be the attempt to root the saving criteria of taste and manners in an ethical soil laid waste by the Benthamite doctrine of expediency. So to kind of like give you a sense of what he's trying to say here. He says that the real ruling force in society is aesthetics. It's what's tasteful, it's what's mannerly. It's not really religion, it's not really law, it's not really big ideas like morals. It's really our lives are governed, and social life is governed by perceptions of what's permissible, what's tacky, what's accepted, what's recommended, what's wise, what's tasteful, things that are forbidden or things that are untasteful, and so on. The problem is that the larger the state grows and the more that law invades our lives, the less room there is for matters of taste and manners to become the deciding force. So what he's saying is that society stops functioning the way it should. The more the state invades our lives, the less society functions like it should, with its informal institutions of conveying information about how we should behave, and what's considered to be permissible and impermissible. If everything becomes a matter of religion and laws and morality, fewer and fewer things become a matter of what's tasteful and what's mannerly, and this informal court of culture functions less and less. It's extremely interesting insight. I like to think about this in light of things like the drug war, for example. So the other day I had this slightly preposterous essay about and Nock, by the way, just he had a huge influence on the way I think about things. I had an essay the other day about how I considered pot to be sort of tacky, and it was over the top. It was hyperbolic. But it is a reflection of the fact. It's a very strange thing. Richard Nixon declared war on pot in 1972, and ever since then the government has said, "Don't smoke pot. Don't smoke pot. It's very bad for you. It's terrible. And we're going to arrest you, and we put people in jail. Millions of people have been jailed, fined, and looted, and pillaged, and everything in the name of the war on pot." And and during the course of which, pot use has become ever more ubiquitous. I mean, more and more, to the point when I was a kid, the pot users were considered slightly deviant and a little bit silly, a little bit dopey, and deviant, essentially. And I watched as pot use became ever more fashionable, because the more law began to control it and say, "Oh, pot is evil, don't do it," the less plausible the claims of the unity of morality and law became, and at a certain degree of nihilism. And he says this word. He says, I forget now where I just read it, but he says, "When the sanctions of law, religion, and morals broke down to the persistent misapplication to matters of conduct quite outside their purview, the sanction of taste and manners become too frail and anemic to be of any practical good. For obvious reasons, then, the resulting state of our society seems to be on hope of improvement. Attempts to galvanize the sanctions of law, religion, and morals for further misapplication are ineffectual. And the ineffectual must also be the attempt to root the saving criteria of taste and manners in an ethical soil laid waste by Benthamite doctrine of expediency." So expediency becomes the only matter. So the problem is that the more centralized law becomes, the larger government becomes, and the more there's this union between morality and law, that becomes increasingly implausible. Like in the case of pot, you have the whole forces of the central state sort of united to say, "Don't smoke pot. It's the great enemy. It's the evil thing. It's just a freaking plant, just like whatever." But no, it's we're going to use the full force of law and justice and every jail and everything else to stop this evil tendency of people to want to suck in a plant into their lungs, or to eat it, And the result is exactly as it was during Prohibition in the 1920s. An implausible exaggeration on the part of a recalcitrant population to overvalue the thing which is illegal relative to other things. And so pot itself is, to my mind, has become just preposterously fashionable, to the point that it's not really a party unless somebody's smoking weed, unless there's a bong present. It's not really a fun place to be. It's a weird distortion that's taken place as a result of the war on drugs. Whereas, I mean, to my mind, if pot had always been legal, we would have a little bit more of a cautionary, slightly balanced view towards it. Maybe it has its place, but it doesn't have to be the universal habit, among all people at all times, it's just an eccentric taste that maybe you try a few times and then you move on with your life. Um, but as a result of the war in pot, we have wildly exaggerated attachment to it, and this happens in every area of life, because the state always seizes on things that are makes a war out of things that are actually not that wrong. Maybe they are not the greatest things that have ever happened, but there's no reason for this kind of wild hysterias, and people push back against implausible uses of the law. So this is sort of Nock's perspective, and I think it offers a very interesting insight into the true nature of the relationship between morality and law. Okay, let's see if I can read some other quotes from this. By the way, there's something very amazing about Nock, that here he was, this sort of, I guess you could say, nowadays would be considered to be a right-winger, although he never thought of himself that way, who was aggressively anti-war, and unapologetically anti-war. In Nock's view, it's the state that crowds out a normal, civilized sense of what is decent and lovely. And he demonstrates this not through deduction as such, but through calm and entertaining tales of how rich and varied productive life can be when the state does not interfere. In his view, in a society without the state, the court of taste and manners would be the thing that guides the operation of society. And this court would have a much larger role than law, legislation, or religion. If such court were not in operation because people are too uncivilized or too ill-educated to maintain it, there would be nothing that the state could do to lift people up, no matter how low civilization is. It can only be made to go lower through state activity. Nock was an old-school Yankee of the pure-bred sort, and he completely rejected what came to be the defining trait of his class, the impulse to try to improve others through badgering and coercion. So let me read you this great quote. One of the most offensive things about a society in which I later found myself was its monstrous itch for changing people. It always seemed to me a society made up of congenital missionaries, natural-born evangelists and propagandists, bent on reshaping and reforming and standardizing people according to a pattern of their own devising. And what a pattern it was, good heavens. When I came to examine it, it seemed to me, in short, a society fundamentally and profoundly ill-bred. This is an aesthetic critique of totalitarianism, essentially. A very small experience of it was enough to convince me that Keynes' heresy was not altogether without reason or without merit, and that conviction quickly ripened into a great horror of an attempt to change anybody, or I should rather say, every wish to change anybody, for that is the important thing. The attempt is relatively immaterial, perhaps, for it is usually its own undoing. But the moment one wishes to change anybody, one becomes like the socialists, the vegetarians, the prohibitionists, and this, as Rabelais says, is a terrible thing to think about. So nice. I like the way he throws the vegetarians in there as forms of Puritans. Anyway. So given such views, it's highly surprising he had nothing but contempt for politics, which then and now seeks to manage society, not only society, but thought as well. He writes, "My first impression of politics was unfavorable, and my dislike was heightened by subsequently noticing that the people around me always spoke of politics and politicians in a tone of contempt. This is understandable. if all I had casually seen was the essence of politics, for if it was part and parcel of carrying on one's country's government, then obviously a decent person could find no place in politics, not even the place of an ordinary voter. For forces of ignorance and brutality and decency would outnumber him 10 to 1. And haven't we all felt that? I mean, the sense of being outnumbered by the forces of brutality and decency. His logic, Albert Nock's logic, takes him down the anarchist road. He writes, nevertheless, there was an anomaly here. We were supposed to respect our government and its laws. Yet, by all accounts, those who were in charge of the government and the making of its laws were the most dreadful swine. Indeed, the very conditions of their tenure precluded there being anything else. So nice. One of the things that's very nice about Nock too is that he wasn't just an anarchist of the leftist school, but he was actually a dedicated proponent of economic liberty, and very much of a kind of a pre-Austrian in his understanding of the role of loose money and loose credit. Now, here, let me read you a quote that he has here in Memoirs on Fiscal Policy. Another strange notion pervading the whole peoples is that the state has money of its own, and nowhere is this absurdity more firmly fixed than in America. The state has money. It produces nothing. Its existence is purely parasitic, maintained by taxation, that is to say, by forces of levies on the production of others. Government money, of which one hears so much about these days, does not exist. There is no such thing. One is especially amused at seeing how largely a naive ignorance of this fact underlies the pernicious measures of Social Security, which have been foisted on the American people. Keep in mind, this is 1943. In various schemes of pensioning, of insurance against sickness, accident, unemployment, and whatnot, one notices that the government is supposed to pay so much into the fund, the employer so much, the workman so much, but the government pays nothing, for it has nothing to pay with. What such schemes actually come to is that the workman pays his own share outright, he pays the employer's share in the enhanced prices of commodities, and he pays the government's share in the form of taxation. He pays the whole bill. When one counts in the unconscionably swollen costs of bureaucratic brokerage, one sees that what the workman beneficiary gets out of the arrangement is about the most expensive form of insurance one could possibly devise, consistent with keeping his promoters out of jail. Very funny. He writes about the income tax as a part of history. Liberals generally, and there may have been exceptions, but I don't know who they were, joined in the agitation of the income tax, in utter disregard of the fact that it meant writing the principle of absolutism into the Constitution, nor did they give a moment's thought to the appalling social effects of an income tax. I never once heard this aspect of the matter discussed. Liberals were also very active in promoting the democratic movement for the popular election of senators. He's talking about these progressive era reforms in 1913. It certainly took no great perspicacity to see that these two measures would straightaway ease our political systems into collectivism. As soon as some Ebulius, some mass man overgifted with sagacity, should maneuver himself into popular things, this would not be long. Speaking of FDR here. Okay. He writes of his early life and denouncing the New Deal and the idea of a grand natural project. He says, I am profoundly thankful that during my formative years, I never had any contact with any institution under state control, not in school, not in college, nor yet in my 3 years of irregular graduate study. No attempt has ever been made by anyone to indoctrinate me with state-inspired views, any views for that matter, of patriotism or nationalism. I was never dragooned into flag worship or hero worship, nor was caught in any spate of verbiage about one's duty to one's country, never debauched by any of the routine devices hatched by scoundrels for inducing a synthetic devotion to one's native land and loyalty to its job holders. Right, Mr. Trump? You know? Therefore, when later the various aspects of contemporary patriotism and nationalism appeared before me, my mind was wholly unprepossessed, and in my view of them was unaffected by any emotional distortion. Here's a passage of immense power that I've reflected on so many times, especially in the course of today's politics, where we're all being urged to act patriotically, nationalistically, to think about a nation as being some sort of organic unity, like a living, breathing thing that we have to have loyalty to. Here's what Nock says. What is patriotism? Is it loyalty to a spot on a map, marked off from others' spots by blue or yellow lines, the spot where one was born? But birth is a pure accident. Surely one is in no way responsible for having been born on this spot or on that. Flaubert had poured a stream of corrosive irony on this idea of patriotism. Is loyalty to a set of political job holders, a king and his court, a president and his bureaucracy, a parliament, a congress, a duce or furor, a camorra of commissars? I should say it depends entirely on what the job holders are like and what they do. Certainly, I have never seen any who commanded my loyalty. I should feel utterly degraded if ever once I thought they could. Does patriotism mean loyalty to a political system and its institutions, constitutional, autocratic, republican, or whatnot? But if history has made anything unmistakably clear, it is that from the standpoint of the individual and his welfare, these are no more than names. The reality, which in the end they are found to cover, is the same for all alike. If a tree be known by its fruits, which I believe is regarded as good and sound doctrine, then the peculiar merit of a system, if it has any, ought to be reflected in the qualities and conditions of the people who live under it. And looking over the peoples and systems of the world, I found no reason in the nature of things why a person should be loyal to one system rather than another. One could see at a glance that there's no saving grace in any system. Whatever merit or demerit may attach to any of them lies in the way it is administered. So when people speak of loyalty to one's country, one must ask them what they mean by that. What is one's country? Jefferson said contemptuously that merchants have no country. The mere spot on they stand does not constitute so strong an attachment from which they draw their gains. But one may ask, why should I? This motive of patriotism seems to me perfectly sound. And if it should be sound for merchants, why not for others who are not merchants? So here's Nock defending merchants against Jefferson. If it holds good in respect to material gains, why not spiritual gains, cultural gains, intellectual and aesthetic gains? As a general principle, I should put it that a man's country is where the things he loves are most respected. Circumstances may have prevented his ever having set foot there, but it remains his country. So beautiful. So beautiful. Okay, let me see if there's anything else I want to finish up here from Nock. Just a slight warning about this book. It's very much of an adult taste. It is not right wing. It is not left wing. He says things that any member of the overly stodgy and most often insufferable Christian right would just be appalled by. I don't want to go into it, but read his chapter on marriage and the family, and you'll get a sense of it. There's some seriously subversive thought in here. In many ways, I would say this book is the beginning of serious political wisdom. And why is that? I think it's because it gradually entices you into a worldview in which you develop an independence of mind. By independence, I mean independence from the civic culture, from the civic religion, from the nationalism of which all of us are a part because of participating in the national political project, and we began to absorb its values. Nock is in many ways, as they say, the red pill. I mean, it's the thing that detaches you from the world around you, gives you a little bit of an elitist cast of mind to rise above it, and to think for yourself. That's what this book does. It does it inauspiciously, subtly, but in a way that's absolutely deadly to the culture of the state and the civic culture, civic institutions that are supported by the state. So, in this sense, this book is quietly revolutionary. As I mentioned earlier, Albert J. Nock was an anarchist. I don't think there's any other way to think of him other than as an anarchist. One of the most brilliant men of letters of the 20th century. He was considered as such in his time, I mean, by which I mean the 1920s, before he fell out of fashion. I consider this book, Memoirs of a Superfluous Man, to be one of the great literary achievements of the 20th century. Read it slowly, read it carefully, read it on a vacation somewhere. This is not a book to read just casually on lunch, at the office or something like that. It's not that kind of book. It's subtle, it's quiet, it's radical, it's devastating. And I can promise you, you will never be the same after reading it. I know among my friends, those who have read this book and tackled it seriously, they're a special breed. They have a special distance to public affairs. They have a special knowing, understanding of the world around them. They do not take life, certainly politics, national life, too seriously. The downside of Nock, of course, is if you take him, if you read him and understand him, you can develop a certain aloofness, actually, to national political culture, which may not be always the best approach to take. But it does leave a lasting impact on you. When should you read it? It's probably a little bit too powerful for a high school student. I wouldn't recommend it. But junior, senior year in college, yeah, awesome. I can imagine what it must be like. I didn't read until many, many years later, and even for me, it had a profound effect on my understanding. It embedded and entrenched a sort of anarchist cast of mind in thinking about the world, and I never quite got over it. As I say, Nock did not write this book to be a bestseller. It will never be commonly read, but it's a beautiful gift. It's a beautiful gift to us that he left us for how to think and live as a truly independent person, not a sheep in a flock, not a soldier in an army, but as what we were meant to be, independent individuals, unique in all respects, unwilling to be manipulated, mentally and intellectually implacable in the face of all national hysterias and trends. Unusual guy, very unusual. 20th century only gave us a handful of people like Albert J. Nock. But how can we not be thrilled that people like this really existed? They can teach us help us, get us through our times in which we live. In some ways, Albert J. Nock, though he died so many years ago, and this book itself is written, whatever it is, 75 years ago, still speaks to us today in beautiful and powerful ways. So that's my fair warning. Prepare yourself, dig in deep, go to your vacation home, take it with you over the summer, over the winter holidays. Come back January, ready to face life with a new, full of humor, a new independence of mind, a detachment from the civic culture around you, and probably finding yourself increasingly embedded in Albert J. Nock's aristocratic anarchism that only he could sort of fully embody. It's a very beautiful thing. Well, thank you so much for being with me tonight, and for hanging around and talking about one of my favorite thinkers, Albert J. Nock. Let's remember him, appreciate what he did. He had a gigantic influence over a century, and it speaks to us in ways that few others writers today do. As I say, the pacing is different. It's a different style of prose than maybe you're used to from online. It's none of this stuff would work as an online essay, I can promise you. It's very old world. Anyway, thank you for being with me tonight, and I look forward to seeing you next week. This weekend was a weekend for the SFL regional conferences are going on. Wonderful. I went to Birmingham yesterday. A brilliant series of lectures. I was a closing lecture. This coming weekend we're doing the Atlanta thing. If you're around, come and join us. These are wonderful events. And the fall, which I think of as being the SFL regional season. It's just great. It's beautiful to be at these events and see all these new, young, hardcore libertarians, being hatched all over the place by exposure to these beautiful ideas. Thank you for being with me tonight. I look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.